Texas, July 1945. The mess hall at Camp Swift stood in the brutal afternoon heat, metal roof radiating waves that made the air shimmer like water. 8-year-old Hans Muller sat at a long wooden table, staring at the tray in front of him. Scrambled eggs, sausage, toast with butter, an orange, milk in a glass bottle. He had been in the civilian internment section for 3 days, processed with his mother and sister after their father's capture. Hans touched the sausage with one finger, brought it to his nose, looked up at the American sergeant serving him, and asked in halting English, "Is this real food?" The question stopped the entire mess hall. The Muller family had lived in Hamburg, where Ernst Muller worked as a railway administrator, and his wife Anna taught music at a local school. They had 2 children, Hans, 8, and his sister Greta, 11. They were ordinary people living through extraordinary times, doing what most civilians did, surviving, adapting, pretending the war would somehow end without destroying everything they knew. By early 1945, pretending became impossible. Hamburg had been bombed repeatedly since 1943. Their apartment building lost its roof. Food rations shrank to starvation levels. Ernst was conscripted in February, sent to defend positions that would fall within weeks. Anna received no letters, no notification, just silence. In April, as Allied forces advanced, Anna made a decision. They would flee west toward the American lines rather than east toward the Soviets. She had heard the propaganda about both sides, but friends who had fled east sent back horrific stories when they sent anything at all. The Americans, she gambled, might be the lesser danger. They left Hamburg with a suitcase and whatever food Anna could carry. The roads were clogged with refugees, soldiers, displaced persons moving in all directions, everyone seeking safety that existed nowhere. They walked for weeks, sleeping in abandoned buildings, eating whatever they could forage or trade. Hans remembered very little of this journey. Just walking, just hunger, just his mother's voice telling him to keep moving, that they would find food soon, that everything would be all right, even when her face said she didn't believe it. They encountered American forces outside Frankfurt in early May. Soldiers appeared on the road, weapons ready, calling in English for everyone to stop. Anna raised her hands, instructed her children to do the same, and waited for whatever came next. The Americans separated them into categories: men, women with children, women alone, suspected military personnel. Anna and the children were placed in the women with children group, 60 people, mostly mothers with young kids, all exhausted and terrified and uncertain. They were transported in trucks to a temporary processing center, given medical examinations, photographed, documented. The American personnel were efficient but not cruel. No one was harmed. Food was provided: thin soup, bread, water. Adequate but minimal. An interpreter explained their situation. Ernst Muller had been identified as a prisoner of war, captured near the Rhine. His family would be classified as civilian internees, given dependent status, and eventually transported to a family camp in the United States for the war's duration. America. The word seemed impossible. Hans had never imagined leaving Germany, much less crossing an ocean to the enemy's homeland. Anna asked through the interpreter, "What will happen to us there?" "You'll be housed in the civilian facility, receive food and medical care, and be allowed to work if you choose. When the war officially ends and repatriation begins, you'll return to Germany. Will we see my husband? Possibly, if he's sent to the same region. But we can't guarantee family reunification during internment." Anna nodded, accepting terms she had no power to negotiate. They boarded a Liberty ship in late May, packed into cargo holds with hundreds of other German civilians. The crossing took 12 days, during which Hans was violently seasick, unable to eat the minimal rations provided, losing weight he couldn't afford to lose. Greta tried to care for him, holding his hand during the worst moments, telling him stories to distract from these constant nausea, and the terror of being on the ocean in a metal ship surrounded by people who spoke languages he didn't understand. When they finally arrived in New York Harbor and transferred to trains heading southwest, Hans weighed perhaps 45 pounds. His ribs showed through his shirt. His eyes were sunken, his skin grayish. Anna was terrified he wouldn't survive the journey, that she had brought her children across an ocean, only to watch them die in a foreign land. The train ride to Texas took 4 days. Through the windows, America unfolded in proportions that seemed fantastical. Cities larger than Hamburg, farms extending beyond the horizon, cattle in numbers that couldn't be real. And everywhere, people who looked well-fed, buildings undamaged, stores with goods in windows. Hans pressed his face to the glass, trying to understand. "Where are the bomb sites?" he asked his mother in German. "America wasn't bombed," Anna replied. "The war didn't reach here. But we were told America was destroyed, that they were starving like us." Anna looked at her son with tired eyes. "They lied to us about many things, Hans. We're learning that now." The civilian internment section at Camp Swift was separate from the military POW compound, but part of the same administrative complex. Approximately 200 German civilians lived there. Families of captured servicemen, former German nationals caught in the U.S. when war began. A few suspected sympathizers swept up in security operations. The facilities were basic but adequate. Barracks divided into family quarters, a mess hall, a small school for children, a medical clinic, recreational areas. Far better than the conditions most have left behind in Europe. Anna and her children were assigned to Barracks 7, a room with 3 cots, footlockers, and a small window. Clean sheets. Solid roof. Privacy. More than they'd had in months. A woman from the camp administration, a German-American named Mrs. Weber, who served as liaison and interpreter, showed them around. Explained the rules, the daily schedule, the resources available. "The mess hall serves 3 meals daily," Mrs. Weber said in German. "Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. You'll receive the same rations as American support personnel." "Real meals?" Anna asked. "Every day?" Mrs. Weber smiled gently. "Real meals, as much as you can eat. This is America. Food is not scarce here." Anna started crying. Not from happiness exactly. From the shock of discovering that while her children starved, abundance existed just across an ocean. From anger at the lies she'd been told. From grief at everything lost unnecessarily. Mrs. Weber understood. She had seen this reaction dozens of times. The cognitive dissonance of Germans arriving in American camps and discovering the propaganda about American poverty and starvation was completely false. Breakfast was scheduled for 7. Anna woke her children early, made them wash faces and hands, brush hair, present themselves properly. Some instinct toward dignity persisted even in these circumstances. They walked to the mess hall with other families, all moving silently, uncertain what to expect. The building smelled like coffee and bacon and something sweet cinnamon maybe, or vanilla. Smells Hans couldn't remember experiencing. Inside, long tables with benches. A serving line where American soldiers and civilian staff ladled food onto metal trays. No ceremony, no formality. Just people eating breakfast. Anna took trays for herself and the children, moved through the line. A soldier served each of them. Scrambled eggs, sausage links, toast with butter, an orange, milk in glass bottles. Hans stared at his tray. He had not seen this much food on one plate in 2 years, maybe longer. His mind couldn't process it. This had to be a mistake, or a trick, or a test. They sat at a table near the back. Greta began eating cautiously, taking small bites, not trusting her stomach with sudden abundance. Anna ate mechanically, tears running down her face that she didn't bother wiping away. Hans just stared. The sausage looked perfect, brown and glistening with fat. The eggs were yellow and fluffy. The bread was white and soft. The orange was a color so vivid it seemed artificial. Sergeant James Walker was on mess hall duty that morning, supervising the serving line, ensuring everything ran smoothly. He noticed the new arrivals, always easy to spot because they looked shocked by the portions. He walked over to check on them, see if they needed anything. The boy was just staring at his food, not eating, looking confused. Walker knelt down beside the table. "You okay, son?" he asked. Hans didn't understand the English. He looked at his mother for translation. Anna explained haltingly what the soldier had asked. Hans looked at Walker, then at the food, then back at Walker. He asked, in the halting English he'd been learning, "Is this real food?" The question hit Walker like a physical blow. Is this real food? The kid genuinely didn't know if the meal in front of him was actual food or some kind of substitute or ersatz product. "Yes," Walker said carefully. "This is real food. Real eggs, real sausage, real bread. You can eat it." "Every day?" Hans asked. "We get this every day?" 3 meals a day, Walker confirmed. "Every day." Hans touched the sausage again, as if confirming it was solid. Then he picked it up with his hands. No fork, no manners, just hunger, and bit into it. The taste overwhelmed him. Fat and salt and meat, flavors his body had forgotten existed. He began crying while he ate, tears streaming down his face as he chewed, unable to stop either the eating or the crying. Around him, other children at nearby tables watched this scene and understood completely. They had all experienced some version of this moment. Walker felt his own eyes burning. He stood up, turned away, and walked back to the serving line before anyone could see his face. By mid-morning, the story had spread through the entire camp. The little German boy who asked if the food was real. The question that captured everything about the propaganda lies, the starvation, the cognitive dissonance of discovering abundance in the place they'd been taught, was impoverished. In the military POW section, German soldiers heard about it from guards who worked both areas. Some dismissed it as American manipulation. Others began questioning what they'd been told. In the civilian section, mothers discussed it quietly while children attended makeshift school. The question represented something they'd all felt but hadn't articulated, the shocking gap between what they'd been promised and what actually existed. Mrs. Weber called an evening meeting in the recreation hall. She wanted to address this directly before rumors and confusion made things worse. 100 people gathered. Mrs. Weber stood at the front, speaking in German that most understood. "I know many of you are struggling with what you've seen here," she began. "The food, the conditions, the reality of America compared to what you were taught. I want to talk about this honestly." She paused, letting the weight settle. "You were told lies. Systematic, deliberate lies designed to make you accept suffering by believing everyone suffered equally. You were told America was poor, that Americans were starving, that the enemy was as desperate as you were. None of that was true." A woman in the audience called out, "But why? Why lie to us?" Mrs. Weber chose her words carefully. "Because hungry people are easier to control. Because if you knew abundance existed elsewhere, you might question why you were starving. Because the regime needed you to believe sacrifice was universal, not just required of you." The next day, at camp's makeshift school, 20 children ages 6 to 14, taught by a volunteer teacher named Mr. Hartman, became a space for processing these revelations. Hartman was a former university professor from Berlin, interned because he had published papers critical of the regime before the war. He saw his role as helping children unlearn propaganda while learning facts. Hans raised his hand during morning session. "Mr. Hartman, if America had so much food, why didn't they share it with us?" The question was innocent, but complicated. Hartman considered how to answer honestly without oversimplifying. During the war, America sent food to its allies, he said. Britain, the Soviet Union, countries fighting against Germany. But Germany was the enemy. Why would America feed people trying to destroy them? But we weren't trying to destroy anyone, Hans protested. We were just living, just children. You're right, Hartman agreed. Children are never the enemy. But wars don't distinguish very well between soldiers and civilians. Everyone suffers, even people who never chose to fight. Another child, a girl named Else, asked, "Were we bad people? Is that why we starved?" "No," Hartman said firmly. "You were not bad. You were trapped in a system created by people who didn't care about your welfare. That's different from being bad." "But we believed the lies," Else persisted. "Doesn't that make us stupid?" "It makes you human," Hartman replied. "Everyone believes lies when they're told often enough and backed by authority. The important thing is what you do when you learn the truth." That evening, Anna sat on her cot writing a letter she would never send. It was addressed to her husband Ernst, wherever he was, and it contained everything she needed to say about the journey, the camp, and the revelations. "Ernst, our son asked an American soldier if the food was real. He could not believe that eggs and sausage existed, that they weren't some substitute or trick. He has been starving so long that abundance seemed impossible. I am angry, Ernst. Angry that we were lied to. Angry that our children suffered needlessly, while food existed in quantities we can barely imagine. Angry that we accepted the lies, because we didn't know we could question them. They feed us 3 meals daily here. Real food, in quantities that shock me each time. Hans is gaining weight. Greta is less afraid. I am learning that the enemy was never what we were taught. I don't know what happens when we return to Germany. I don't know what country we're returning to. But I know we cannot return to the beliefs we held before. Those were lies, and we must teach our children to recognize lies when they hear them again. I hope you are alive. I hope you are fed. I hope when this ends, we can rebuild something honest. Anna." She folded the letter, placed it in her footlocker, beside other unmailed letters, a diary of sorts, recording thoughts she couldn't voice aloud. In August, the camp administration announced a project. The civilian internees could cultivate a garden plot for fresh vegetables. The work was voluntary. The produce would supplement camp meals, and it would give people something productive to occupy their time. Anna volunteered immediately. She had grown up on a small farm, knew plants and soil, needed work that felt purposeful. Hans and Greta helped, along with 20 other internees. They planted tomatoes, beans, squash, lettuce crops that grew quickly in Texas heat. The American staff provided seeds, tools, instruction. The internees provided labor and something else, the cathartic experience of growing food after years of watching it disappear. Hans worked the garden with unexpected dedication. He learned the names of plants in English, asked endless questions about soil and watering and seasons. Sergeant Walker, who oversaw the project, became his informal teacher. "Why do you care about farming?" Walker asked one afternoon, both of them weeding tomato rows in 100-degree heat. "Because I want to understand where food comes from," Hans replied in his improving English. "So I never forget that it's real." Walker understood. The garden was more than food production. It was rehabilitation, proof that growth was possible, that nurturing something could produce results. By September, the garden yielded abundantly. Tomatoes in quantities nobody had anticipated, beans filling baskets, squash growing to improbable sizes. The harvest was ceremonial. The entire civilian section gathered, children included, to pick the vegetables they had grown. The camp photographer documented images that would later appear in reports about the humane treatment of civilian internees. Hans picked a tomato the size of his fist, held it up in sunlight, and took a bite without washing it. The flavor was intense acidic and sweet and sun-warmed. Juice ran down his chin. He laughed, purely delighted, in a way Anna hadn't heard since before the war. Other children followed his example, eating tomatoes and beans straight from the plants, dirt and all, celebrating abundance with the unself-conscious joy that only children could manage. The adults watched with complex emotions: pride in the harvest, grief for the years their children had gone hungry, hope that maybe, somehow, life could be rebuilt. Mr. Hartman's school evolved beyond basic lessons. He began teaching what he called truth literacy, helping children distinguish fact from propaganda, evidence from assertion, reality from manipulation. He used their own experiences as case studies. You were told Americans were poor. What evidence did you have for that belief? The government told us. One child answered. What other evidence? Silence. No one had seen America before arriving. No one had independent verification. They had simply believed authority. This is how propaganda works, Hartman explained. It fills in gaps in your knowledge with lies, then prevents you from gathering evidence that might contradict those lies. You believed Americans were poor because you never met an American, never saw America, never had any information except what you were told. How do we avoid believing lies in the future? Greta asked. Seek evidence, Hartman said. Ask questions. When someone makes a claim, ask, how do they know? What evidence supports this? Who benefits if I believe it? Those questions protect against manipulation. Hans raised his hand, but I'm 8. Who will believe me when I ask questions? Start by asking yourself, Hartman said. You don't need others' permission to think critically. Japan's surrender in August 1945 marked the war's official end. The news reached Camp Swift through radio broadcasts, newspapers, and official announcements. The internees reacted with complicated emotions: relief that fighting had stopped, uncertainty about what came next. Repatriation would begin soon, the administration announced. Transport back to Germany would be organized by priority. Families with young children first, then others. Most internees would return home by early 1946. Home. The word carried strange weight. Germany was occupied, divided, its cities destroyed. What did home even mean in such circumstances? Anna discussed it with other mothers one evening. Do we want to return? One asked. Our children are healthy here, fed, safe. What awaits them in Germany? Our families, Anna replied. Our language, our culture. However broken, it's still ours. But our children are learning English, another woman said. They're adapting. Maybe we should stay. We can't stay, Anna said firmly. This isn't our country. We were brought here as internees, not immigrants. We have no right to remain. In November, the Muller family received notification. They were scheduled for repatriation in December, transport to Bremen, and responsible for their own journey to Hamburg. Hans was devastated. He had grown accustomed to regular meals, to the garden, to Sergeant Walker's patient teaching. America had become familiar. The thought of returning to destroyed Hamburg terrified him. I don't want to go back, he told his mother. There's no food there, no safety. Anna knelt down to his eye level. I know, but Germany is our home. We have to help rebuild it. And you're going to remember everything you learned here, about food, about growing things, about asking questions. You'll take that knowledge with you. What if I forget? And I'll remind you, Anna said. We'll remind each other. Hans made a list in his notebook, things he wanted to remember. The taste of real eggs, the smell of tomatoes sun-warmed on the vine, the weight of a sausage, the color of an orange, Sergeant Walker's patience, Mr. Hartman's lessons about truth. The garden that proved growth was possible. On their final day, Walker came to say goodbye. He brought a gift, a packet of tomato seeds saved from the garden. Plant these when you get home, Walker said. Grow food. Remember that life continues after war. Hans took the seeds carefully, as if they were precious gems. "I'll remember everything," he promised. "I believe you will," Walker replied. December 1945. The Muller family arrived in Bremen, processed through repatriation centers, and began the journey to Hamburg. The city they found was unrecognizable. Block after block of rubble. People living in basements and damaged buildings. Food scarce and rationed. They located Ernst through Red Cross channels. He had survived, was being released from a POW camp in England. The family reunited in early 1946, 4 people who had become different during their separation. Ernst was thinner, older, quieter. The war had broken something in him that wouldn't fully heal. But he was alive. They had all survived. They found housing in 3 rooms of a partially damaged building. Ernst found work with the Reconstruction Administration. Anna gave music lessons to children whose parents could pay in food rather than money. And Hans planted the tomato seeds Walker had given him. In a small plot beside their building, Hans cleared rubble, mixed soil, and planted Walker's seeds. His father helped, though Ernst said little, still processing his own trauma. The tomatoes grew slowly in Hamburg's cooler climate. Hans tended them obsessively, remembering Walker's instructions, applying lessons learned in Texas sun to German spring. When the first tomato ripened in July 1946, Hans picked it ceremonially. His family gathered mother, father, sister, and they each took a bite, passing it around like communion. "This is real food," Hans said, "just like in America." Ernst, who knew nothing of the story, asked, "What does that mean?" Anna explained the question Hans had asked, the revelation it represented, the lies they had been told, and the truth they had learned. Ernst listened quietly. Then he said, "We have to remember this. When they tell us new lies, we have to remember we learned to question." Hans attended school in Hamburg, where teachers attempted to continue where regime education had left off. But Mr. Hartmann's lessons had changed how Hans processed information. When a teacher stated something as fact, Hans asked, "How do you know that? What evidence supports it?" Most teachers had no good answers. They were repeating textbooks, following curriculum, transmitting information they hadn't verified. Hans became known as the boy who asks too many questions, not quite a compliment in a system that valued obedience. But Anna encouraged it, even when it created problems. "Never stop asking," she told him. "That's how we avoid being lied to again." In 1948, when international mail normalized, Hans wrote to Sergeant Walker. The letter took 6 weeks to reach Cedar Rapids, Iowa, forwarded through military records offices. "Dear Sergeant Walker, I am Hans Muller from Camp Swift. You gave me tomato seeds when we left. I planted them in Hamburg, and they grew. Every summer since, I save seeds and plant them again. The tomatoes remind me that food is real and abundance is possible. I am doing well in school. I ask many questions. Some teachers don't like this, but my mother says you told me to question things. So I do. Thank you for teaching me about gardens and truth. I will remember." Walker replied months later, his letter equally brief but warm. He was proud Hans remembered. He hoped Hans would continue asking questions and growing things. The correspondence continued sporadically for years. Not frequent, just occasional updates on lives rebuilt from war's ruins. In 1985, Hans Muller was 58, a botanist at Hamburg University specializing in agricultural development. He had spent his career studying food production, teaching farmers, researching crop yields. A journalist interviewing him about his work asked, "When did you become interested in agriculture?" Hans told him about the question, about asking an American soldier if food was real, about learning that lies have consequences, that starvation was policy, not necessity, that questioning authority was not just permitted but essential. The story appeared in a Hamburg newspaper. Other former civilian internees contacted Hans, sharing their own memories of American camps, their own moments of cognitive dissonance when propaganda met reality. They formed a small organization, Germans who had been detained in American camps and wanted to document their experiences honestly, without Cold War propaganda from either side. Just the truth about what they had witnessed. Hans lived until 2008, died at 81, left behind his wife, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and hundreds of students he had taught over 5 decades. His obituary mentioned his work in agricultural science, his teaching, and briefly, Dr. Muller's interest in food security began during internment in the United States following World War II, where he learned that questioning propaganda and pursuing truth were essential skills for surviving troubled times. His children donated his papers to the university archive. Among them, the original packet of seeds from Sergeant Walker, long since dried but preserved. A reminder that one small gift, one patient answer to a child's question, could shape an entire life. The question, is this real food? Captured something essential about propaganda's cruelty. It made children doubt basic reality. It taught them that hunger was universal when it was actually policy. It transformed abundance into something unbelievable. Hans Muller asked that question in a Texas mess hall in 1945 and spent the next 63 years answering it by growing food, by teaching truth, by questioning authority, by remembering that lies have consequences and evidence matters more than assertion. The story persists because it illustrates what many forget, that propaganda's greatest harm is not what it makes you believe, but what it makes you unable to believe. That children who doubt the reality of eggs and sausage have been robbed of something more fundamental than nutrition. And it persists because of what happened after the question. An entire camp stopped. Soldiers and civilians alike confronted the gap between propaganda and truth. And a little boy learned that the world was larger, stranger, and more abundant than the lies he'd been told. In a mess hall in Texas, 8-year-old Hans Muller asked if food was real and discovered that questions matter more than answers. That truth exists independent of what authority claims, and that tomato seeds carried in a pocket can grow into a lifetime of remembering what's worth questioning and what's worth believing. That is the legacy, not just of one question, but of the willingness to ask it and the courage to accept the answer, however destabilizing.